Rated T for teen.
Each year, thousands of adults lose their shred. It's an epidemic simply known as shred loss. But it doesn't have to be this way, because rekindling your shred is as easy as playing the new Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4. With new parks, cross-platform multiplayer, and sick new game modes, we can put an end to shred loss everywhere. Get the new Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 and show the world that the shred's not dead. Pre-order Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 and play the Foundry demo.
This episode is brought to you by Dogfish Head Craft Brewery. The Grateful Dead and Dogfish Head have gotten the band back together with the release of Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale, a light-bodied pale ale brewed with sustainable kernza grains, granola, and heaps of good karma for a refreshing brew that's music to your taste buds. Available nationwide, visit dogfish.com to find Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale in your neck of the woods. Dogfish Head Craft Brewery is located in Milton, Delaware. Please drink responsibly.
It is difficult when four people are telling the story because it's actually four different stories. I mean, you must realize it's got to be somewhat of a compromise when four people are involved. But we're trying to just say how it felt to us. I mean, it is both a record, a video, a television program, a book, and no doubt somewhere down the line it will also be a t-shirt.
Thanks everybody for coming out. This is the Something About the Beatles podcast that we're taping live, at least part of today. Erin picked the topic, and you want to tell us why you picked it and what it is?
Well, Robert and I have done a number of shows, obviously, about historical methods and historiography. One of the things I try to emphasize to people on those shows and also on my blog is just because a source is flawed doesn't mean it isn't impactful. And in fact, I would argue that some of the most influential and important sources in all Beatles historiography have serious flaws. So one of the things that we're going to do today is we're going to discuss the most important / influential sources in Beatles historiography. So it's not just books, because you are incorporating the element of sources in there too, and you're going to get some books that some people frankly don't like, but the criteria isn't are they accurate or are they good, it's how important are they, how important were they, how influential were they for fans and for other authors. So I'm the one who came up with the top 10 list idea, and Robert ran with it. So we only saw each other's lists a couple hours ago, so we weren't, conspiring with one another. There's a little bit of overlap, but there are some ones that might come out of left field, so it'll be interesting to see what people's reactions are. So I will let Robert go first.
Okay. All right. So when Erin put this to me as the 10 most important and or influential Beatles sources, and as she described, not limiting it to books, it could be anything. The first thought I had was that there are things that are influential in a negative way, meaning they wielded a lot of impact in the Beatle perceptions of their history. Things that were demonstrably untrue got picked up by other authors unquestionably and repeated in further works, therefore tarnishing them. Or there are books that are treated like they're gospel. And of that, I'm speaking of the Jeff Emmerich memoir, Here, There, and Everywhere, which everybody, it seems far too many people not only regard it as, oh, so this is how they recorded that stuff, this is what happened. He gives an excruciating detailed dialogue that happened and what they were feeling in his writing, his telling of this 40 years after it happened. That's one problem, is that people regard it like it's a serious book and not a memoir, which may or may not involve, well, this is the way I see it, this was my perspective and whatever. The other thing is far too many other authors writing about the recording of the Beatles songs take it as gospel, like, oh, he was there, therefore he knows. And there are a lot of problems with that book, so that's how it made my list. The important part of the sources I saw as things that if you are a serious Beatle fan and you want to get to the bottom of what they did, how they did it in the most accurate fashion possible, and I think that is your baseline criteria, is accuracy, not tarnished by whatever agenda or spin comes from the source, even inadvertent, even not necessarily in a bad way, it's just how they remember it, or in all innocence, this is how they're putting out their story as they know it. we sort of dig down into the things that are important that every fan should read because maybe they happen to be quite accurate or very well sourced or in any other way something we would consider top source material. Does that kind of cover it?
Yes.
All right, you can go first.
Okay.
Whatever end.
I say let's start with our number ones and work our way down so it's not a typical countdown. So my number one is one that might seem to come out of left field, and remember it's sources, not just books. So my number one is A Hard Day's Night when it comes to influential sources in Beatles historiography. I think the impact of that movie was so fundamental on fans' perspectives, first generation fans in particular, but later generations, our perspective of the Beatles as a unit, as a group, of these indivisible four friends, their chemistry when it came to making music, the album, obviously, that's associated with the movie, but also in particular, how you have Richard Lester talking about how he assigned a specific characteristic to each individual Beatle. So you have, with that movie, the adoption of the cute one and the quiet one and the smart one and Ringo, the unlucky one. And you have interviews from Ringo in 1969 talking about how they're still receiving scripts that follow that formula. And you have him complaining in an interview in 1980, 1981 about how he is still living with a legacy of the personality characteristics that were assigned him in A Hard Day's Night. So we have this movie that was frankly made in order to make money as quickly as possible before the Beatles' star burned out, which everyone anticipated was going to happen, and instead it becomes this fundamental document of the Fab Four narrative and has both positive and negative repercussions for the way we see the Beatles as a group and individually for the rest of their lives.
That says it very, very well. I think Ringo, especially of all people to have a problem with that film, it informed any discussion of Ringo going forward. And it was reinforced in near contemporaneous time by the Beatles cartoon, I think, where you again have those, John's the unquestioned leader, Paul's the cute ladies' man, and George is the jocular, avuncular younger brother, and Ringo's the one that's always getting into trouble. It has led, I think the natural extension of that sort of thinking has led to this very day of so many people underrating him as a musician. And to anybody out there, you see online commentary all the time. Every time I think that I've seen the last of the alleged John Lennon quote was, is Ringo the greatest rock drummer? He's not even the greatest drummer in the Beatles, which he never said. It's nonsense. It was made up by an English comedian named Jasper Carrott. I think the perception that he must have been just the luckiest guy to ever live to get that golden ticket just before the Beatles exploded big with rudimentary skills. The only people I've seen that don't hold that belief or don't question it are musicians. It's people that are non-musicians. Oh, well, he's no John Bonham. He's no Neil Peart. Therefore, he sucks. Therefore, he's worthless and he just got lucky. So we've devoted any number of episodes on something about the Beatles to digging down deep into what Ringo brought to the group as a drummer and certainly as a personality. So that doesn't need to be argued anymore, I feel. But to Erin's point, I think Hard Day's Night was the start of that perception that he was the guy he was on the big screen. It's black and white, therefore, if not a documentary, something close to it, because it felt like it. And we knew that the mania was happening. They're playing guys with their same names. So I think that psychologically we wanted to believe that was a pretty accurate telling.
And it's worldwide. It has such a wide scope and a wide audience that it reaches, that it goes beyond the scope of an everyday interview or press conference or even some of the books that we're talking about, given the time period in which it was released. And for some fans, that would have been their first real impression of the Beatles, and especially trying to figure out or discern between Paul, between John, between George, between Ringo, which Beatle was which, for one thing, depending on how casual of a fan you were at that point in time. So it solidified them and caricaturized them for the rest of their lives.
And you have to imagine a world that if you're a first generation fan, fine, you've got perceptions that might have been shaped by their TV appearances, by their records, by their interviews on radio and such. If you're a second generation fan like I was coming into fandom in the 70s, you can count on one hand the number of decent Beatle books worth reading there were at that time. And A Hard Day's Night, it could have been a lousy movie. It could have been Ferry Cross the Mersey or Catch Us If You Can or one of these other cash-ins of a British invasion done at the time. But instead, because independent of the Beatles and their talent, it had legs. It was a damn good piece of filmmaking, an influential piece of filmmaking. Therefore, on those merits alone, regardless of the soundtrack, it was going to get shown over and over again on TV. And I'm old enough to remember being one of those fans with a portable cassette recorder holding the microphone up, because that was like the first time I saw the Beatles in motion. I knew the records by that time, but oh my God, they're performing. And seeing that, there was no YouTube, there was no internet, couldn't just summon this stuff up at will. There was no home video. You had to catch it. It was an event. Oh, Channel 9 showing A Hard Day's Night on Saturday night? Gotta catch that. Gotta have my blank cassette ready. So that was what you did. There was no home video to tape it off of. It carried an awful lot of weight because it was a great film, because it rang true, and because it lasted past the initial Beatles era of fandom. As you say, worldwide and going on for years and years and years.
Well, and one more thing, just to keep in mind, not only with A Hard Day's Night, but with all the other sources that we're dealing with, when I look at any book in Beatles historiography or movie or film or documentary, anything, I wonder to myself, or I think to myself, what if this were the first source I was introduced to on the Beatles? And that's whether it's a website, in addition to that. This is the first thing that's telling me the story. For millions of fans, that would have been A Hard Day's Night. And that your first exposure to a version of events is fundamental to how your understanding of that fandom evolves.
It's true, your first exposure to a lot of things carries the most weight, whether you want to admit it or not. If you hear a song by somebody and later on you find out that's a cover version of it, or there's a better version coming along, something like that, you might still prefer the first one you heard. That tends to happen more often than not, I think. Following Erin's number one for influential, my number one for influential, the Red and the Blue albums. Again, not a fan in the 60s. I became a fan in the 70s. Those came out in the spring of 73. The first officially sanctioned compilations came into being to fight the pirate sold on TV collection called Alpha Omega that was literally just pirated needle drops of Beatle recordings done alphabetically, which is novel. It was the Red and the Blue albums that were put out. It was a beautiful package. The symmetry of the 63 Beatles and then the 69 Beatles, it was irresistible. Red, blue. That neatly demarcated period, the touring years, starting with Love Me Do in 62 and ending with 66, with the last album they dropped before stopping the road, and starting where they picked up after the resumption as a studio band, Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, up to the bitter end and the last U.S. single, Long and Winding Road. Unlike the straitjacket of Beatles 1, the later CD collection, which used that very narrow criteria, as if the Beatles were a singles band from start to finish. They weren't. Halfway through, they switched to being an album band, and most of their most important material were album tracks. So to me, it always gave a sort of warped perspective if you were a newbie coming into it. Good if it makes you a fan, but it's not representative of their career, folks. This was much more comprehensive, although it took me years to sort of pick up on the fact that whoever was picking the tracks, and I think we decided it was Al Steckler, who is Alan Klein's right-hand guy at ABCO, did the track selection, and George and John signed off on it. They had their thumb on the scale for Rubber Soul. There's like 6 Rubber Soul tracks and 2 from Revolver. If it had that effect on me, where eventually I realized, wow, this is really not very balanced at all, I'm wondering if that sort of led to the undervaluing of the Revolver album for a lot of years by a lot of fans, maybe till come the CD era, when it sort of stepped out of Pepper's shadow with the UK iteration with 3 more songs coming out and being made more widely available. But it was the gateway drug for me, and now it's all this. And talking to so many fans of my age or later, not so much before me because they would have experienced the Beatles in real time, but it absolutely was the thing that sucked them in and sent them down that rabbit hole. So for that, I think it not only subjectively did have a lot of influence on me, but I think it did for people of that age group.
Well, and people later on, the Red and Blue albums were my first real exposure to the Beatles music.
On cassette.
It might have been, yes, on cassette, back in the early to mid-90s. So right when we were, bridging over from cassettes to CDs. and we had those on cassette tape, and I listened to them off and on, and that's my first real exposure to Beatles music. And yeah, absolutely, I think they hold up well despite their murky origins.
And as we're speaking, there was an announcement that was due to be made this week. Have you heard about this? That apparently they're getting ready to rejigger these, put them back out, augmented with things they overlooked the first time. So if that wields the same power as it did over us, that would be probably not a bad thing.
So my second is another, again, source. We're kind of fudging that word for the moment. That's coming out of left field, and that is the internet. And this is my second and my third numbers on my list, and there are two particular reasons for that. And the first has to do with the issue of how the internet has democratized, for better or for worse, how we get our information and how we research. So, discussed this with Robert, and I've thought about it extensively as well, how if you came to one of these fests in the 70s or the 80s, you had essentially maybe about 10 to 15, let's say, Beatles authorities, for lack of a better term. And they were primarily authors who had published Beatles books, or individuals who had been engineers and been in on their sessions. So that means that I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase this. There are certain elements in the publishing industry that therefore you're not going to be able to go in depth into really particular sub areas. Or you are going to have a page count, you are going to have a word count. So there are areas that you as an author or as a fan might be fascinated in, but you aren't able to delve into them. And you might have pitched an idea or a perspective to the publisher, and the publisher came back to you and said, we don't think that's going to sell, you've got to write on something else. So there's a narrow funnel of authority of where you're getting all of your information. And what the internet has done, obviously not only with the Beatles, but with everything else, is that now you can listen to Beatles podcasts from the moment you wake up in the morning until the moment you go to bed at night, and you can delve into minutia involving them in a way that you weren't getting from the authorities in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, up until we got to the internet. And it's changing how people research, because there used to be scrambles for newspaper articles, for interviews. He was just talking about putting his recorder up to the television so that he could record some of a hard day's night. Now you can pull that up on YouTube, and you can access so many primary and secondary sources that you didn't have available to you. So you have this element of research, and that's one of the areas that has fundamentally changed or been so important and influential on Beatles historiography, Beatles history. But then I'd argue that the second element of that, and the third item on my list, it's changed how we are fans. And this is something that you see not just with the Beatles, but with fans of other areas. I'm a massive Kansas City Chiefs football fan, and fandom has changed from the 90s, where I was 11 or 12 years old. If I wanted to watch a highlight, then I had to hope that they would have a highlight or two on the local news. And that was it. That was my option. Whereas now, you have YouTube and you have Twitter, and you can find endless reams of information. You can listen to podcasts all day, from the moment you wake up in the morning till the moment you go to bed at night, drilling down into linebacker formations. So you can delve into the minutia in things in fandom, in the Beatles, in sports, in a way that you could not do in the 70s and the 80s to the same extent. The information that we have is truly astonishing, and you can just, those of you who have been to fests in the 70s and the 80s, just compare and contrast what your perspective was, what your experience was in the 70s and the 80s, as opposed to now.
Absolutely. And to build on what you said, which is huge in terms of the way it has impacted Beatles scholarship as well as virtually everything else, I think it's been a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I'm not sure if there's a correlation or not. I haven't thought about it that deeply, but it seems that in my lifetime, from when I became a fan in the 70s, limited number of books, some quickie books published in the 60s, plus the Hunter Davies book, Julian Fast, I think Anthony Scaduto did one in 68 as well. And then the 70s, the Beatles split up, more books start coming into print. Apple to the Core, Longest Cocktail Party, and by decade's end, we had Beatles Forever, we had Growing Up with the Beatles by Ron Schomburg, we had Satire, Paperback Writer by Mark Schipper. It was developing in John Lennon's lifetime, but as the publishing geared up on Beatle subject matter into the 80s in the wake of John Lennon's murder, the standards didn't seem to be where they are now. And as we'll talk about in terms of source material, you could put out almost anything. And if it was nicely packaged and well written, it would be embraced. And come to find out, once the bar had been raised by the turn of the century, the 2000s, I think it's after I started writing Beatle books is when I really saw the bar start to rise, where I have to think this is a correlation to the internet in terms of more source material being available, that suddenly fans weren't going to settle for the same old regurgitated crap. They were starting to know better. It's like, well, wait a minute, I downloaded this file and actually this is how it went. So this is the downside, this is the flip side of that coin, is that suddenly everybody was an expert. Everybody could write a book or start a podcast or something like that because they too had access to the same internet sources. I would say beyond that, there's a certain amount of knowing how to filter and assess your data. That is where the expertise comes in, where the people actually track down and interview worthy subjects. It's not just reading a bunch of questionable material online or watching YouTube videos that informs you. You have to have a filter. You have to understand and have some kind of criteria and critical thinking and analytical thinking apply to it. So the internet's been huge. I think it ultimately raised the Beatles scholarship, but suddenly everyone's an expert too. So you have to absolutely factor that in. For an influential source, again, going back to my period, the 70s, for what it's worth, one of the books that when we had such a limited array of sources, and being an American fan, you had that little fact sheet that came inside the Read the Blue Albums called Your Information that aspired to be a discography of the Apple Capitol Beatle releases. There were factual errors in it. I was chasing things for years that didn't exist because it said so there. But we had even less familiarity with the UK catalog, which was the Beatles standard. That was what they put out. That was what they curated. That was what they sequenced, all that stuff. I do know that one of the first books I did read was The Longest Cocktail Party by Richard DeLello, because my local library had it. Who, if you don't know that book or don't know him, he was the house hippie at Apple. He was an aide to press officer Derek Taylor. And so he did a memoir published in 72 or 73 on his years of working at Apple. There was talk of a film about it a while ago that one of the Gallagher brothers was going to produce, and unfortunately it didn't happen. But I would love for that to be made into a film if it's done well straight out of the book. But anyway, at the back of the book, as part of an appendix, they had the UK discography. So that was helpful to me. It's like, oh, this is Beatles for sale. I never heard of this. And what do you mean help? It doesn't have all this orchestral stuff on it. It's got other tunes. So the Beatles Illustrated Record, when it came out, it was written by two journalists from New Musical Express in England, Roy Carr and Tony Tyler. It was literally the size of an album cover. It was a paperback book. It was about 12 by 12 trim. So full size album cover reproduction illustrations in there. And it went through chapter and verse. It was not a story of the Beatles' history. It was a story of their releases, starting with Love Me Do, and every single that followed, as well as the ancillary EPs, as well as the LPs as they followed. They didn't bother much with the American stuff, but it then, after 1970, the solo years, they had a section, and that was where you can read about stuff that you couldn't just walk into the record store and find in the 1970s. Oh, Ringo had an album called Sentimental Journey. It's not on the rack here. I had no idea. Or some of the more obscure stuff. I had no idea about the triad of experimental, unfinished music things John had done. I mean, I kind of knew about Two Virgins just because of notoriety, but I didn't know the other stuff, as well as George's experimental electronic sound, things like that. So it was a very comprehensive look at all their releases and a bit of their history as it traces it through. And because it was so graphic heavy, and mostly it was the verbiage. These guys were UK journalists. I mean, they're catty as hell. They would not sacrifice accuracy for the quick, notable quip or burn of somebody, particularly George. And I have to say, it was very influential in my thinking. On my limited resources going into the 70s, okay, I've got the Beatles catalog. What solo album should I get? Well, they don't like Dark Horse, I'm not gonna get that one. Things like that. Using, as I would later use, the Rolling Stone record guide as a source of, what should I buy of this act I've never heard of before. So I think, anecdotally at least, of us of a certain generation, it wielded a lot of power because it brought American fans up to speed on the UK catalog, because it was so richly illustrated, and because of the snark that has stayed with me to this day that is in the text. I can sum that stuff up very easily because it just packs your wallop at the time.
And how memorable a source is matters immensely. How good the writing is, again, if it's quippy, if it's memorable, then it's going to stick in your brain. And if it's going to stick in your brain, good or bad, it's going to have influence, it's going to have importance. But one of the things that Robert was talking about was the limited resources. And that's something that we see, again, in historiography, just when you have fewer options to choose from on a subject, then the options you do have are simply going to carry more weight. Because, okay, you've got 5 different biographies of the band, then if they all tell the same story in particular, then there's only one version of the history. Or if you only have one book like this, like he was talking about, the Beatles Illustrated Record, and it gives you the quippy criticism of George, that's going to stick with you because you don't have a counter narrative or a counter version coming from another author. And so, I've said this before on my blog, one of the things I always try to keep in perspective is if I were teaching a Beatles class in college in the 1970s, what books would I have available to me? I'd probably wind up using that book to help teach the class, although I'd talk to the class about the issues with it, but I wouldn't really have that many other options.
Right. I think what you said in terms of memorability, when something is clever and funny, it's going to stick with you. Also, as with music, I think if it hits you at the right age, when you're just a sponge psychologically in those teen years where I don't care how long you live, it tends to be the music you were the most fond of is the music that hits you at those ages, no matter what the music is. You're lucky in the sense that you were hearing a lot of older music during those years, and I had Boston, Kiss, but I transcended it.
So I'm next, and this one isn't quite so much out of left field. In fact, there's a good argument that this should be my number 1, and that is the Authorized Biography. The Authorized Biography, to me, is fundamentally important in Beatles historiography for a number of reasons. We could spend an entire podcast just talking about the Authorized Biography, but one of the things that I always pay attention to is what other Beatles authorities, what other Beatles authors, etc., how often do they use this source? And suffice it to say, everybody uses something from the Authorized Biography. Its reputation did get dinged after the Lennon Remembers interview and some of the criticisms that came in that interview and in the 1970s. But the reality is that everybody still uses it, that you have had Davies defend it and argue that the editing that was done to it was minimal. There's elements in there that you are not going to get anywhere else, and it's the most extensive look we have at them in that particular time period. But also, one of the things I find really interesting about the Authorized Biography is how you can make a significant argument that it impacted their history later on. And I don't mean just how their history is told, because one of the speculations that you can make, and I believe we have a considerable amount of evidence, we have an overwhelming amount of evidence, obviously, that Alan Klein was obsessed with the Beatles, and that he researched them, he wanted to find out everything he could about them in order to make his pitch to them. He approached the Rolling Stones. He got information from the Rolling Stones. What can you tell me about the Beatles? What can you tell me about these guys? He read their interviews. And the Authorized Biography came out months before Alan Klein had his first meeting with John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And for those of you who have read the Authorized Biography, one of the significant aspects of the Authorized Biography includes John Lennon talking about how he had had a lifelong need to be in the premier position in any hierarchy, and how that had been something he had dealt with since school, that had been something with his friends. Now it says in the Authorized Biography that that has diminished enough that he can still be happy even when he's not in the number one position. But what do we get from Alan Klein in his David Vedder interview in November 1971? We have Alan Klein talking about how he pitched himself to John in part by emphasizing John's premier position in the band. So I think you can make an argument that Alan Klein, who again collected and read everything he could on the Beatles, read the Authorized Biography and used it as insight. How can I pitch myself to John Lennon to be their manager? Because I've wanted to be their manager for years. This is how I'm going to pitch myself. I'm going to emphasize to him, and this lifelong desire he's had to be number one, that he is going to be, I'm going to make sure that he is viewed and seen as the premier Beatle at a point in time where he feels like he's losing ground, which is something else that's mentioned in the Authorized Biography. You have Davies saying flat out, in some ways, Paul is the leader now and not John. So again, we can't prove it. We don't have a picture of Alan Klein flipping through the Authorized Biography, but that would be one of the other reasons, not just because of its influence on other authors, but because I think you could make a strong case that it had a ripple effect on their history as it unfolded.
Klein, in effect, weaponized it.
You said it so much better than I did. You said in like 7 words what I tried to say in 70.
The irony of that book and its timing, it was an authorized biography. Hunter Davies was a journalist in England, and older than the Beatles journalists, which I think is important. And he got access. He got absolute access. And when he came along, when this thing was started, he was sitting in the room during the writing sessions for Sgt. Pepper. Mm-hmm. So that's how we know a bit about how they worked at that time post-touring, which is fascinating. The unfortunate thing about it is the timing, in that by the time it hit the street in September of '68, their world had blown up completely. The advent of Yoko Ono, the breakup of Paul and Jane, now he's about to get serious with Linda, Brian's dead, they've taken over their own affairs, Apple, White Album's coming out. So everything he'd written about, with these inside looks at the Beatles and their wives and their families and all that stuff, all turned upside down. And I think maybe for that reason that it appeared instantly outdated, the public maybe came to move past it pretty quickly. And then come the death of John Lennon, what's on the stands, what's in the bookstores then, but it's been supplanted by Philip Norman's Shout. I think that's how it played out, and it should not be dismissed. It is important first-person source material on the Beatles at that particular period, which is a great time of change, as they're segueing from live band to a studio band.
End of intermission. Part 2.
You and I have talked about Lennon Remembers a bunch in our previous conversations, but now it's through the prism of important and influential.
Right.
And since this conversation started in mid-August in Chicago, suddenly Rolling Stone, Jan Wenner, it's become a thing. It's blown up. The day a lot of people have been waiting for has happened.
Yeah, I just don't understand how you can get so much public criticism for something and then just refuse to acknowledge, hey, this might be an issue. Or even if you don't believe it's an issue, pay a little lip service to it. But he evidently had no interest in doing that until it was too late and he'd stuck his foot in his mouth. I mean, and not just stuck his foot in his mouth, but like kept
digging deeper.
Took the shovel out and kept digging. It was, wow.
The impression I had was that there were plenty of people out there waiting for this moment to happen. Like, they had beef with him for a long time, and finally, through his own doing, he hung by his own petard. It just happened in a way that they're taking shots at him through the years. A couple years ago, when those different books came out on Rolling Stone and Wenner, and then he responds with his own book, I think that was the start of his fall from grace, where he'd been pretty untouchable. At least his influence had been not really challenged in any meaningful way to this point. But now, with the comments he made that he didn't have to make, and with this book that's conspicuous in the 21st century with the selectivity in his subjects, it's like, this stuff isn't going to fly anymore.
Well, and what exactly was his comment? That he didn't find female or black artists intellectually stimulating enough?
Or articulate or something?
Articulate, yes. And wow.
But they can dance.
Even if I didn't know anything else about Wenner, if I had never studied the Beatles, I would have read that interview and thought, what are you thinking? The marginalization of them, for one thing, but also, what are you thinking saying this?
He's thinking he's untouchable. Or he is just giving up on, like, you know what, I've been the king of the castle long enough. Somebody else take the throne at this point. He's throwing in the towel, almost. Especially in that there was no way to sort of finesse this into what I meant to say actually, and now it's all this. He painted himself into a corner.
So it's ride or die with my white male rock icons.
Yes. I saw it as like, okay, it's an adjustment that needed to happen. Him stepping down with the influence he wielded over Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I've always been of two minds of that whole thing anyway. It's obviously extremely subjective. What is the purpose of it? Well, there's sports Hall of Fames. There's other kinds of Hall of Fames.
Right.
It's definitely something that the very base criteria seems to be, yeah, they're famous and they sold a lot of records. You can pay lip service to people who didn't sell records but were influential,
right,
that are on our favorites list, like a Velvet Underground or somebody like that, Captain Beefheart. But
right,
it just seemed to be an extension of his own ego and tastes with the people that richly, by any yardstick, deserved inclusion or recognition for their careers, influence, or originality, any kind of criteria you want to apply to it, that either didn't make it in for decades or haven't made it in at all. So on the one hand, it's nice to have a rock and roll museum. It's nice to be able to have a place to go to see artifacts and things like that.
Right.
But if you're supposed to be the be-all and end-all of what's worthy and what isn't, then obviously you got a long way to go, and it should be framed that way. It should be understood, well, this is what Jan Wenner and company think are the greatest. It's really an extension of Rolling Stone, and some other magazine, Spin or
right,
Pitchfork or somebody else would be hosting a completely different hall of recognition. But
right,
ultimately, I'm glad it exists, but I recognize it's deeply flawed and meaningless in terms of if you're in there, it means this, and if you're not, it means this.
Right. And my understanding is that the criteria to get in the Hall of Fame has always been, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has always been deliberately opaque.
Yeah, and also it's transactional as well.
Right.
So there's that.
Whereas with like the NFL Hall of Fame, it's public. And so if you're an NFL player who wants to get in the Hall of Fame, like an Associated Press, they have regional representatives for certain teams. So like there was a reporter for the Kansas City Star. He just happened to work for the Kansas City Star a couple years ago, but he was appointed to be the Hall of Fame representative for people for like Chicago and Indianapolis, the Bears, the Colts, the Chiefs, all that sort of stuff. And when they had a player primarily from one of those teams who was on the list, then they had to make a pitch. This is why this individual should be in the Hall of Fame. And sometimes the pitches were like 10, 15 minutes in statistics. And sometimes it was basically the guy just standing up and saying Peyton Manning is eligible for the Hall of Fame and then sitting down. Because that's all you have to do with some of these guys. And obviously the Beatles, you don't have to make a pitch for them to go into the Hall of Fame. You just say the Beatles are eligible for the Hall of Fame. But yeah, just how opaque it was. Again, we're spending more time talking about Wenner than I anticipated. But
it's no secret. I think everybody who listens to this show, if you've done any reading on Wenner and the origins of Rolling Stone, he started the magazine because he wanted to meet John Lennon.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so at base, it was an expression of his fandom. And then Beatles split up. John's got a new record to sell and selling the John and Yoko mindset as well.
Right.
So who better? Rolling Stone by that time, in the 3 years it had been in publication, had grown in influence as rock criticism is coming into its own, rock journalism. So it was the perfect platform to get his messaging out there. You read Lennon Remembers, he will contradict himself from one page to the other like a normal person would, and he even calls himself out.
We all say a lot of things that we don't know what we're talking about. I'm probably doing it now. I don't know what I said, See, everybody takes you up on the words you said in 94. I'm just a guy who people ask what about things. I blab off, and some of it makes sense, some of it's bullshit, and some of it's lies, and some of it's God knows what I'm saying,
He was aware of it in real time. He wants to promote his album. He gives this lengthy, hours-long interview with fan number one at Rolling Stone, completely uncritically, not pinning him down like a journalist would on anything. He's just letting him spiel, basically, and just prodding him along. But he knew right away that I don't want this codified. I don't want this published as a book. I don't want to revisit this. As he would say when he was doing that interview with George in 74, it's like when you bang your head and you say, ouch, it doesn't mean that you're going to be feeling that ouch years later. You get through the moment. But Wenner saw it very much in business terms. It's like that's where he sort of put aside his fandom. It's like, I'm going to use this as the publishing goldmine it is and sell a ton of books back when Rolling Stone had an active book publishing arm. Funny that the only other book that I'm aware of that they published around that time was Francie Schwartz's Body Count, a completely unflattering depiction of Paul McCartney.
Right.
So it's like they go hand in glove. Put Lennon on the pedestal and tear down Paul. That tells you everything you need to know right there.
The #1 music magazine, Rolling Stone, for 3 decades has been setting the trends in music and even in fashion. It's a who's who and a what's what of the hottest sounds, coolest styles, and basically all things rock and roll.
You're absolutely right. And one man is responsible for this successful magazine, Jan Wenner, who joins us now for this hour of music from his office in New York City.
Well, thanks. It's hard to believe it's been 30 years since we started Rolling Stone. And that first issue, we sold 5,000 copies.
One interview stands alone in Wenner's mind, John Lennon, an artist who would play a big role in the history of Rolling Stone.
I think what we couldn't foresee was the kind of role that John Lennon would play in the development of Rolling Stone itself.
A feeling also shared by John Lennon and Yoko Ono's son, Sean.
The relationship between my parents and Jan and Rolling Stone throughout the years has been really kind of personal, and, I think they helped each other out at different times when they both needed it.
Lennon Remembers clearly, as we've talked about before, and as you kind of get the perception when you go through the Beatle literature, carried a ton of weight, being as quotable as it was, as vivid, as emotionally charged. John's telling of the Beatles' career and its breakup and who he decides to demonize in the course of that conversation. And unfortunately, nobody challenged him on it in real time, and it packed this influence very much seen in Philip Norman's Shout, in Ray Coleman's Lennon biography, in Nicholas Schaffner's Beatles Forever. All these people that should have known better took it at face value and ran with it. So therefore, it's enormously influential, not for good reason, but it carried that kind of weight.
And that's really where a lot of its influence comes from, for me, is just how many people for how long. Among them, some of the most widely read and used secondary sources in Beatles historiography used it unquestioningly for decades and continued to use it for decades. And the lack of questioning of it, the lack of analysis of it, I think I've said this before, the first author I remember even mentioning this is an interview that needs to be analyzed is Hertzgaard in 1994. And then I'm trying to think whether some other secondary authors, who the next secondary author would be, who delves into that issue.
Mm-hmm.
So you do have some latter day works, such as the Cambridge Companion to the Beatles. They have an excellent essay on the issues that includes a discussion of some of the issues regarding Lennon Remembers. Ian MacDonald does delve into it slightly. And I think he's the one who brings up the point of Wenner being an American, interviewing John, who's English, and Wenner not picking up on John's irony.
Yes.
Or sarcasm. And so with MacDonald, I can't remember whether that's in the first edition or the second edition.
Yeah, I can't either.
So the first edition of his work came out in 94, 95. So it would have piggybacked pretty closely after Hertzgaard. And that's really been one of those elements of Lennon Remembers for me that is so continuously interesting and so continuously baffling, is how many people were invested in taking it at face value, including someone like Nicholas Schaffner. I enjoyed a lot of the aspects of his work, but he does not question, I don't think, anything John says in Lennon Remembers.
Right. I look at it in two ways, and I'm not sure if either is right or maybe a little of both. Either it reinforced what they were already inclined to believe if they had Lennon up on a pedestal already. And Schaffner, his book was published in 1977, so in John's lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm old enough to remember John being regarded as kind of a joke, at least in some of the magazines I was reading, where a lot of the stuff, the antics, the John and Yoko antics, were held up to ridicule. It has made him look like an unserious clown. But all that changed with his martyrdom, and then suddenly he's ascending to the stratosphere in terms of all the messaging put out by Yoko into the guy that supposedly we lost. And you've had people who knew him, like a Ray Connolly, just trying to ratchet that back. It's like, John wasn't that. He wasn't that. And he knew him as well as anybody who wasn't his wife. So on the one hand, if it sort of already aligns with what you're inclined to think about him as painfully honest, except when he's lying through his teeth, to his dying day in Playboy,
right,
about a lot of things. Or part of the power of it might come from the fact that there was no counter-narrative. It filled that vacuum, absent any messaging from McCartney or anyone else to come along to push back that powerfully and articulately and with some kind of resonance to it. That stuff didn't come along till, as you point out, much, much later. So it just hardens and crystallizes. That's the message. That's, if you go out there and want to read a book about the Beatles, if they're all running with what they read in Lennon Remembers and not challenging it or looking at it critically, then that becomes your reality.
Well, and one of the points I made in my book is how it fits into the political climate of the time.
Yes.
And John and Yoko, in that interview, absolutely are placing themselves on the side of the counterculture. They're now arguing that they are in for the revolution that they anticipate is imminent. And that was such an unappreciated aspect, in part why the Beatles breakup was framed the way it was, and why certain people absorbed it the way they did, why certain people wrote it the way they did.
It's a political alignment.
Yes, absolutely. That plays such a crucial role in that primary source. And you have Wenner, for probably political reasons, financial reasons, and self-interest, continuing to promote it as the absolute truth up through 2000. Now, I haven't seen or read any comments or endorsement from Wenner post-2000 regarding his views on Lennon Remembers. But Wenner has a bad habit of putting his foot in his mouth recently. So probably a good thing he's not commenting on certain things.
I'm just assuming that Yoko and he are still on good terms, that she may look fondly at him as somebody who served their needs for so long, so loyally, and she's not going to be willing to stick her neck out to defend him now.
Well, how old is she now?
90.
90. So she may be preoccupied with other matters.
It's true. A lot of elements at play, and conversely, you have, with the rise of rock journalism at that time, as epitomized by Rolling Stone, but also Crawdaddy, Cream, the other things that were coming into their own, there starts to be this value attached to what is perceived as authenticity, something far more valuable than blatant commercialism.
Right.
And who was the most blatantly commercial and successful at that time but Paul McCartney? Therefore, you have the messaging from John likening him to Engelbert Humperdinck, and we were just his sidemen, but also his innate grasp of how to put out a hit single and a hit album once he got going consistently with Band on the Run, your favorite album, and how it seemed like to those steeped in those values that he was just an empty suit, that he was just somebody out to pursue commercial success and dollars without anything to say. So I think in its way, it brings down his esteem while building John's as somebody who was certainly no less commercial. He just didn't have the same knack for it, and it was wrapped in all this political messaging at the same time, therefore more serious.
Yeah, and I think it's the Cambridge Companion to the Beatles, which There's the Cambridge Companion to the Beatles and the Cambridge Companion to Rock and Pop, and I can't recommend those highly enough for anyone listening to this podcast. They contain some absolutely wonderful essays. And I think it might be Michael Frontani in one of those essays where he discusses the contradiction at the heart of rock and roll is that you have this anti-establishment message that nonetheless is utterly dependent on selling records.
Right. Thread that needle.
And commercially.
So that pretty much covers the subject of Lennon Remembers in terms of influential/important, would you say? Is there anything else left to cover on that base?
Not really. I guess this could be applied to a lot of the different sources that we're going to discuss, and that's the availability of it, how widely available it is.
Mm-hmm.
You can find it at maybe not any library, but it's easy to access. You can find it online. You can find audio versions. It's really the click of a button away.
Yes.
And it's always been easily accessible, either as a magazine interview or as a book, as you mentioned. And it's easily accessible for fans and it's easily accessible for authors. And we've discussed how that carries a great deal of weight for secondary authors. If they're doing research, then they just pull off some of the most easily available sources, like here's Lennon Remembers and here's the Playboy interview. So this should cover everything I absolutely need to know in writing my biography of John Lennon.
Right.
So that's something to keep in mind, not just with Lennon Remembers, how widely available it is, but for a lot of the sources that we're discussing.
Yeah.
So what's your next one?
All right. Boy, we've done the Red and Blue albums. We talked about Illustrated Record. Lennon Remembers. So I have as influential, it's sort of an extension of the Lennon Remembers and Hunter Davies discussions, Philip Norman's Shout. Not as important in the sense that it's unimpeachable or a must-read per se, but it is influential in that the Hunter Davies book had sort of been played out within John Lennon's lifetime, published in '68, still available, but because it was published right on the cusp of massive change in their lives. They were still a group, but by the time it hit the street, the marriage to Cynthia is over. Mm-hmm. The relationship with Jane Asher is over. Brian Epstein is over. Mm-hmm. And they're running their own affairs. It's a very different group, completely different landscape than where the manuscript was conceived and finished off in. So that tended to make it, well, it's a nice little period piece if you want to see the Beatles from 1967, but what about the rest of the story? And that sort of paves the way for somebody else to come along with some ambition and possibly an agenda, and that was Philip Norman, who comes along and puts that out, begins work on it, and gets it, I guess, finished. I can't remember right now if it actually hit the street in Lennon's lifetime or just after, but it was more or less finished.
It was after. He submitted the manuscript in November 1980. He was allowed, obviously, to write a new forward introduction following Lennon's death. And then the actual book published came out in March 1981. Okay.
So the timing is exquisite for anybody interested in reading about the Beatles, reading about the late martyr John Lennon, and who hadn't bothered to pick up Hunter Davies or wanted an update, wanted a deep dive of all their history. And there it is. It's comparable in that it's clearly written by a successful journalist who seems to have done his homework, but he's a Lennonista. And so it has that spin to it and lack of objectivity. And you can go through it in terms of counting errors of fact, if you want to go down that route. But in the absence of anything else, it carried a ton of weight at a time when people were most ready to want to read a deep analysis or narrative of the Beatles' history. And there it was. And there it stayed for a good number of years.
And that is number 7 on my list.
Okay.
So that is absolutely one that we both agree is one of the most influential sources in Beatles historiography. And you covered a lot of the timing and why it resonated the way it did when it was published. And one of the other elements for me as to why it is so influential and so important is how many other authors use it, even to this day, even sometimes in situations where Norman's version of the Beatles contradicts their own version of the Beatles. So to go back to some of the authors who essentially endorsed Shout, you have Ian MacDonald in the first edition of Revolution in the Head calling Norman out for his anti-Paul bias in the book, but also saying it's the best biography available on the band. You have John Harris, a writer for The Guardian, who covers the Beatles in a lot of ways, as late as 2012, calling it one of the most essential books on the Beatles. It still makes a lot of top 10 lists when it comes to books that you should read about the Beatles, books that explore further into the Beatles, most important works on the Beatles. It's making our top 10 list, although not for complimentary reasons.
Exactly.
But for facing the reality of how influential it is. You have Larry Kane in his book, When They Were Boys, referring to it, I believe, as the gold standard or something to that effect of Beatles biographies, even though Philip Norman's version of George Harrison is very different from Larry Kane's interpretation of George Harrison. That's really where Shout's influence is so extremely powerful to me, not just because of the first generation fans that read it or the second generation fans that read it, but because for so long it was the biography of the group, in part because there was nowhere else to go. Mm-hmm. Again, you have MacDonald saying this is a book that is flawed in that it is biased against one half of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership, but you're not going to find a better one.
And he's saying that in 94.
He's saying that in 94.
Right. So Bob Spitz hadn't done his book yet.
Well, and that's the issue. You could start debating, when do we get a superior group biography of the Beatles?
Have we?
I infinitely prefer Gould, Jonathan Gould.
Absolutely.
And his methodology is very solid. His writing is top-notch. And really, that's one of the things that you have to give Norman his credit for, is that he is an extremely evocative writer. But so is Gould. Mm-hmm. So perhaps one of the reasons that we didn't have someone jostling with Norman for this position as the premier Beatles group biographer is because people didn't want to face off against his writing ability. Mm. And that's just purely speculation on my part.
Yeah, I do think that, as we've noted, Norman was the recipient of being the guy with the right product at the right time in a way that Gould wasn't. For all the merits of his book, it didn't get that space, it didn't get that hype. Mm-hmm. Next time you see that coming from an American author, it's with Bob Spitz in his book, which was going to be this event. And it just kind of fell short for various reasons. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact there were so many easily correctable errors of fact in that book. Mm-hmm. The fact that he didn't really run with it when he was called out. His reaction was pretty poor, telling people, well, you know what he was telling people. And it didn't help himself. That's why you never see him showing up at Beatle conventions. It just kind of ended up being this doorstop. I'd see it all the time in used bookstores, and I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's forgotten, but it doesn't have the esteem that it might have had, at least that it seemed to aim for when it came out.
Yes, I'd certainly rank Spitz's work in terms of influence significantly below Norman's, and in terms of methodology, significantly below Gould's.
Oh, yes.
But I've said before on my blog, people ask me for a go-to Beatles group biography. Given that Lewisohn isn't done, right now, my answer is Gould.
Yep, as well as should be. And that was a tough one for me to not put in my top 10. I think that the only reason I didn't was if I had to limit it to 10, it would have been in the 11 list for sure. Mm-hmm. But there were things that I felt I had to include in this list. And in a way, following your lead of not necessarily limiting it to books, but also putting in other things that were influential as well, I had to make space for that. So it's not any slight on my part that it's not in my top 10. Was it in yours?
No, unfortunately. And probably the only reason it's not in my top 10 is that in my reading, I didn't see Gould do original research. Mm. So he compiled a great deal of existing research. His analysis of the evidence that he had was, in my reading, balanced. It was objective. He often presented both sides of a multi-sided dispute. His methodology was very good. And again, the writing is really top-notch.
And there is a place for that. Mm-hmm. For somebody that sort of synthesizes the data that's out there, looking to strike a balance that is absent for a lot of things that are getting a lot of attention.
Right. if this was a different list, if this was the best sources on the Beatles, Gold would absolutely be in my top 10. But as we discussed at the fest and as we're discussing now, it's not necessarily best or most accurate. It's most important / most influential. And unfortunately, Gold just doesn't make that cut.
Yeah, understood. So where do we go from here?
Well, let's see. That was your number 4, and that was my number 7.
It was my 3 in influential, I think.
Okay.
Shout was.
Okay. So my next one, since you just went, is the Complete Beatles Recording Sessions. And this is incredibly influential for a number of reasons. Foremost, for me, it is so incredibly influential because of how many authors use it, how many other secondary authors use this information. And in part, they have to use this information because they can't get this information from anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Because Lewisohn is the only one who has access to it, or had access to it.
Yes, he had access, yeah.
And so this is where the parallel fascinates me, is that I've plugged this non-Beatles book before on my own podcast, but I'll plug it on here too. There's an excellent historical examination of John Hay and John Nicolay, and they were Abraham Lincoln's secretaries during his presidency.
Mm-hmm.
And it's both a history of Hay and Nicolay and an examination of how they impacted Lincoln's historiography. And they are colossal figures in the creation of Lincoln's historiography. And part of that is because they were friends with Robert Lincoln, Lincoln's only surviving child. And he gave them, some decades after Abraham was dead, access to Lincoln's archives and private papers.
Mm.
And he only allowed Hay and Nicolay access to those private papers. And so for approximately 50 years, they used those papers along with their own recollections, their own memoirs, their own documentation from when they were Lincoln's secretaries. And they wrote I can't remember whether it's 9-volume or 12-volume history of Abraham Lincoln.
Right, it's massive.
Yes. And what happened is that they were the only ones who had access to that library given to them by Robert Lincoln for 50 years.
Which in effect made it an authorized biography.
Yes, and Robert Lincoln did have editing power over their work. That was part of the quid pro quo of, yes, you can access these papers, but I want to be able to have the right to make any revisions or edits. I can't remember exactly how extensive those edits were, but what that means is that all of these other authors who are writing Lincoln biographies, who are not John Hay and John Nicolay, they have to use Hay and Nicolay's work because they can't access those primary sources for 50 years. And it must have been incredibly frustrating for them because they can't get to the actual primary sources, which means they have to use Hay and Nicolay's interpretation of those sources, which means they can't interpret them themselves. And so that's where I see this fascinating parallel here with Lewisohn. I'm sure there are any number of other Beatles authors. I've talked to some other Beatles authors who would desperately love to get into those archives and listen to those tapes, but they can't.
Right.
And that means they have to rely on Lewisohn's version of those tapes. And they're incredibly valuable. I'd argue that they made a significant push or helped with the significant momentum in shifting us away from the Lennon Remembers and the Shout narratives. You have material that we otherwise would not be able to access. And so I'm very grateful that Lewisohn gave us the Complete Beatles Recording Sessions, and it's an amazing reference work. But a lot of the information in there is a secondary source because it's the tapes filtered through Lewisohn's interpretation.
To which I would add, and this is a pretty common critique of Lewisohn, is that for all his gifts as a writer, an analyst, an interpreter, and a guy coming up with a thesis based on the data he is sorting through, a weak spot seems to be music analysis. Lots of people can write about music that aren't musicians. He seems to particularly not have a feel for it as much as other people do. And come Rock Band, and suddenly the stems are being made available, and all kinds of stuff just flooding the underground market in terms of studio recordings, run-throughs, rehearsals, outtakes, that sort of thing that we didn't have access to at the time Recording Sessions was published, but now we don't have all of it. We don't have Carnival of Light, but we've got a lot more than we did back when that book was published. And you get to hear it through your own ears and compare it to what Lewisohn had to say about it. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's what he thinks is the best take, or, that kind of thing. It's at odds with the way other people hear it and see it. And that's fine. That should be. It's not a critique of him. It's just pointing out, though, that, yes, we are hamstrung, as you described with Hay and Nicolay and other authors needing to reach that Lincoln data stuff, the way we were for so many years with Lewisohn and still are in a lot of cases, of what he got to hear and what we still don't have to hear. We have to rely on his interpretation and description of things.
Writing about music is like dancing about architecture.
Yes.
So Lewisohn is not good at dancing about architecture?
I guess not. It was extremely revelatory when it came out because, of course, nobody had access to that stuff. I'm trying to remember, it seems like it was sort of part and parcel of that project. There was the John Barrett tapes. You know what that is?
Refresh my memory.
So he was the EMI engineer that was dying of cancer. And just to give him a job, they had him listen to and catalog all the stuff. So that stuff started to sift out come the digital era. So that was giving us some insights to stuff. So as more and more this data was coming out and then starting to be used as projects, like there was the Aborted Sessions album, but then it became Anthology and more fleshed out and things like that. We're getting more and more of this stuff. We can compare it to what Lewisohn had to say about it, which is interesting. But then you have these deep scholarly dives. I'm thinking of the Recording the Beatles book. Not generally available. It was a $100 book when it was first published. They've been promising an update of it for decades now, which hasn't happened. And it's one that was published in a limited edition. I highly recommend it to anybody who can get their hands on it. I never even owned a copy, but I had access to it with a musician friend of mine who had it. And it was just mind-blowing the depth that it went way beyond Lewisohn's recording sessions in terms of the information presented of the Beatles in the studio and how they did it and all that sort of thing. So, and then, of course, you have Jerry Hammack's series, which does new explorations of the data available since Lewisohn did recording sessions. And Lewisohn himself has all but disowned that book, saying it's grossly out of date and he'd love to redo it and all that stuff. And that's to his credit. He recognized the limitations in view of what we know now. But at the time, it was incredibly revelatory and mind-blowing. And I, as sort of a cheat in my list in terms of important, I put Lewisohn Chronicles, which was his sort of compending the timeline chronology stuff as well as recording sessions and all, shoving into one book, Beatles Live. And I've got that / Tune In. Damned important. He has his esteemed place as a historian for a good reason. Tune In is a much deeper dive, obviously in a more limited period, particularly if you get the expanded version, which is whatever it is, 1,500 pages or something like that in 2 slipcase volumes. Incredible research and certainly revelatory in what we now know about that period of their career. To cite one example, how his research puts George Martin's account of how the Beatles came to be signed to EMI completely at odds. It rewrites that completely. So, great. Something that nobody either had access to or bothered to research as deeply as he did when he came to write those books. So, unbelievably important. They have to be on anybody's list who's taking the Beatles' history seriously. To me, it's a matter of, well, how deep do you want to go? You want to go really deep? Get Tune In. If you want a nice, deep overview on solid academic ground in terms of research and data, then you've got Chronicles or recording sessions covering that aspect. Beatles Live, which doesn't seem to get a lot of attention, that was his first Beatle book, chronicling every gig they ever did. And it came with that flexi of their earliest surviving interview from October 62. That was important too. Nobody had done that before.
Funny, you mentioning how Lewisohn's work disputed George Martin's version of why he signed the band, because I think it might be Martin who wrote the foreword for the Beatles Live. And he says something to the effect of how so much scholarship on the Beatles has been complete rubbish. He claims that Lewisohn is one who sets the bar higher than that. I'd have to look at exactly what it is Martin says, but it's amusing to think of now.
To his credit, and he wrote a few books, starting with All You Need Is Ears, which was in Lennon's lifetime again. That was in the 70s.
79.
There are things that he says we know to be flat out wrong, but a lot of it he does frame as, to the best of my recollection, or as I recall it, something like that. He qualifies it. So that's, I think, what you should say about a memoir, rather than putting it out there as, well, this is how it happened, and I know because I was there. And that's the way people regard Here, There, and Everywhere from Jeff Emmerich.
Right. But yes, what I come back to with the Complete Beatles Recording Sessions would be the biggest one, because, again, Lewisohn's the only one who had access to it. But really, all of Lewisohn's work is how many other secondary authors use his research, use the Beatles' life. And you see his influence in MacDonald. I believe MacDonald says he wouldn't have written Revolution in the Head if it weren't for Lewisohn. And you see his influence in Gould, and you see, obviously, his influence in many Beatles writers today.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a parallel in your readings of history, whether it be Civil War or other aspects of history, where one guy is the guy who did so much deep research and examination that sort of was the game changer for the subject?
I'd have to think on that for a while. Nothing's springing to mind at the moment.
Okay.
It's been a long day.
Okay.
But, the 1960s, we had a German historian who got access to the complete German archives.
For which war?
World War I.
Okay.
And prior to that point in time, Germany would allow access to part of the archives. And this was the first historian allowed access to the entire archives. And I want to say the last name is Fisher. And
I think I remember reading this in your book, actually.
Yeah, he discovered some previously undiscovered, or at least not very well known pieces of evidence, such as a meeting in 1912 where the Kaiser was advocating for war immediately. He only backed down because his admirals told him that the Navy wasn't ready. So that was used as a piece of further evidence to argue what Germany had mainly been arguing against for decades, and that was that Germany was the primary instigator of pushing for the war. So having said that, it's some interesting evidence, but World War I is something that people still go at hammer and tongs regarding historiographical arguments. So I don't want to say that after that it was, this is the case and it's open and shut. But again, parallels with Lewisohn is that he was the first to get this primary source evidence that nobody else had really been able to access.
Do you foresee a day where there's going to be a counter-narrative to Lewisohn about the same ground he's covered so far?
What I foresee is people using Lewisohn's evidence, but interpreting them differently, interpreting it differently. So Lewisohn has found, and I'm not saying every new piece of evidence he came up with, for example, in Tune In or in the subsequent volumes, that everyone is going to disagree with. But I've said before, what really interests me is the primary source evidence more than anything else. And so you can have primary source evidence and you can have 2 or 3 different interpretations of it, depending on context, depending on, well, hopefully not methodology, but individuals who might pay more attention to one aspect of methodology than another, or the time period that they're writing, or all of these particular elements. And there are some people who currently interpret some of the evidence in Tune In differently than Lewisohn does. But what I immensely admire and appreciate about Lewisohn is that he gives you the evidence. So you can look at the evidence, see where he found it, which again provides valuable context, and you are not forced to accept his interpretation unquestioningly, because if you want to delve into it, you can find the evidence yourself. And that's one of the things that I most appreciate about Lewisohn. So history isn't static. I do believe Lewisohn's interpretation of events is going to have an enormous amount of sway in Beatles historiography. But very few versions of history become the end-all be-all.
Right. What I wonder about is, at the time he started his work, he was more or less the official historian of the Beatles, and then there was a separation and a distancing, and then he was on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So he started his work when he had access. I wonder, because clearly the pattern has been, going back to Lincoln and probably before that, you trade access for control of the narrative. And if the Beatles, Apple, the Beatles heirs, whoever's controlling the original source material, the files, let's say, decide who they're going to give that access to, implicit in that is for the story we want to tell.
Right.
And if we know anything about the way Apple and the surviving Beatles have been running things, it's that there is absolutely a narrative they want to put out there. Look no further than, and for all they didn't want to make any cuts, or they didn't put any qualifications on my work, Peter Jackson and Get Back. He satisfied his masters.
That's a discussion for another time.
Yes. Yeah. It's crystal clear. He was out to satisfy some people.
That is a podcast.
Yes, it is. Is it my turn?
I don't remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't remember either. We kind of both had on our list, so if you want to go ahead, go ahead.
Okay. So this is going to reinforce the theme I've been discussing again about influence and how sources are influential, not just because a significant amount of people read them, but because of how many other secondary sources use them and how many fans use them. And so this one, I have Babuke.
Oh, yes.
And I have the Beatles Here.
Uh-huh.
And I will be the first to admit, I am not a musician. I am certainly not that knowledgeable about different types of guitars, different types of drums, pianos, guitars, any of those sort of things. But what is striking to me about Babuke's work, number one, his methodology appears to be pristine. His sources are cited. He has a bibliography. He includes references, and everyone uses him, and everyone trusts him unquestioningly.
Mm-hmm.
And you, again, to name drop again, you have Lewisohn saying in at least a few interviews, or at least one, about how when he has to know about what guitar George was playing in 1963, he goes to Babuke. So that's massive for me, not just that Lewisohn does it, but that everyone does it. It's a reference work, really.
Mm-hmm.
And reference works are sort of the unsung heroes of a historiography because they're not sexy, for lack of a better term. They don't really have a clear narrative. You don't have that much conflict or drama or other storytelling elements in them, but they do the dirty work of a historiography, and everyone refers to them. Other authors refer to them, and fans refer to them. So I think because of his influence in that respect, I would put Babuke in there.
Well said. Any book that can come along in any subject that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for improvement, it's like the work has been done. Who else is going to write a book on the Beatles instruments, and what is there left to say that Andy hasn't said?
Right. That's a good way to put it.
He's given you all the data. It's all based on his research into the instruments, into receipts from Hesse's or whatever music store they bought the stuff. It's not subject to interpretation. It is what it is, and he's connected all the dots beautifully. So,
well, and I'm sure for somebody who is a gearhead who knows drums and guitars, that it's fascinating on an entirely different level than it is for me. I'm looking at it based on the research, but someone who actually plays those instruments or is familiar with those instruments is, again, going to connect with the work in a way that I simply cannot.
And it gives it the credibility of his background. He wasn't some geek researcher who liked the Beatles and decided what niche hasn't been filled yet. Oh, I can go down this route. He was a working musician,
Right.
Still is, and he lived that world. So that adds to his narrative and his way of determining what's important. Oh, this instrument had this neck on it, or this tremolo bar, or whatever. So it satisfies the geeks, the musicians, the gearheads for sure. But people that aren't as steeped in that world, it tells a story. It's like, this was the wherewithal Paul McCartney had in 1961 that he had this much money in his pocket, this is a guitar he could buy, or George Harrison wanted this one, but the guy from Rory Storm bought this Stratocaster from under his nose, so then he had to get the Duo Jet, and it tells their history from a different angle by the gear they had and why they had it.
Right.
Yeah, which is how it shaped the music, when ultimately it's all about the music, right? Rickenbacker gifts George a 12-string Rickenbacker guitar. Nothing he ever aspired to that point in England, but suddenly it's in his hands. Boom, that becomes the sound of A Hard Day's Night, and possibly influences the way they were writing. Fender bestows the group all this gear, these amps, 6-string basses, all this stuff, and that becomes, for the last half of their career, that sound, and them really getting off and playing as a band again because they got all this cool gear. It tells a story of what was in their hands when they were creating this music. So it could be seen as a catalog of just geekdom, or it's like, wow, this is how these records came to be made because this is the gear they had access to. So it works on many levels, which is fabulous. Good call.
Your turn.
All right. I have for important on my list a very early contender, if not the first serious book about the Beatles, Love Me Do by Michael Braun. Mm-hmm. He was a journalist at the time he wrote the book. He sort of had the same role as Alan Owen, who gets hired to write the script for A Hard Day's Night, spends time with them on the road, absorbing their individual personas and what their life is like, and turns that into a script for A Hard Day's Night, focusing on the mania surrounding them. Michael Braun, as a journalist, examining this phenomenon that's starting to happen in England before anybody had any idea what was in store for them, is sitting there, taking it in as a serious writer, looking at it through the lens of the social event that it was, the phenomenon in terms of England culturally at that time. It was a very important thing. He was a serious guy who, with the cred and talent and recognition of what was important, told that story of the Beatles. So much so, you can't throw out everything in Lennon Remembers as him spewing in BS. But he had good words to say about Michael Braun years later.
Love Me Do was a better book by Michael Brown on the Beatles. Right. That was a true book. He wrote How We Were, which was Bastards. You can't be anything else in a situation of such pressurized. And we took it out on people like Neil, Derek, and Mal. And that's why, underneath their facade, they resent us, but they can never show it, and they won't believe it when they read it if it's in print, etc. But they took a lot of shit from us because we were in such a shitty position. It was hard work, and somebody had to take it. Those things are left out, about what bastards we were. With, fucking big bastards. That's what the Beatles were. You have to be a bastard to make it, man, and that's a fact. And the Beatles are the biggest bastards on earth.
So it's not necessarily a flattering book, but it rings true, and because it's not beholden to pleasing Brian Epstein or polishing up their image in a way that Cellar Full of Noise did.
The only wish I have for Braun is that he would have covered more time with them.
Yes.
It's such a short window of time. That's through no flaw of the author. It is what it is. But it is significantly more open than you would get in certain aspects in the Authorized Biography. It doesn't have that official designation.
No.
And the Beatles at that point in time hadn't really refined their PR technique to the extent that they would years later.
Right. Controlling the narrative.
Right. That's something that I always keep in mind when I'm reading any interview from any of these guys, really, let's say 65 on, is how many interviews they had already done by that point in time. And certainly by the time you get to the late 1970s, 1980s, you have to assume that if you're interviewing Paul McCartney in the early 1970s, the late 1970s, you're interviewing John Lennon, that they have given more interviews than you will ever conduct. So they know every trick, and they know every method and every way to deflect and every way to scheme an interview to get it to go the way they want it to go.
Right.
But they hadn't developed that to that extent when they're dealing with Braun, and that could be why you have a more open, honest, and frankly negative depiction in Braun than you get in certain other works, and certainly in certain other interviews.
Right. For that contemporaneous snapshot of such a critical period of their history without the spin, but told by a responsible guy who wasn't out to do a hatchet job, nor was he a fawning member of the fan club.
Right.
He's just reporting it. The Beatles' Progress, the subtitle of the book. It's terrific. And anybody interested in the deep history of them wanting a good contemporaneous account, you can do no better than that.
How hard is Braun's work to find?
It seems to have gone in and out of print a few times. I haven't looked lately on Amazon to see if it's going for $150 or for $10, but I found my first copy of it, I think in John Lennon's lifetime at a Beatle Fest. I think I paid around $10 for it the first time I got it. And it seems to come and go. I tend to think right now it might be out of print, but it seems to pop up every once in a while. Maybe the 90s, maybe around the time of Anthology, it might have been put back into print briefly. I can't remember.
Oh.
Do you have a copy?
I got almost all of my sources via interlibrary loan.
I figure, yeah.
And I think I had the original 1964 Braun edition that it had been recovered, the way libraries sometimes do.
Yeah.
And I think it still had the library card in the back.
Cool. I know mine's a British printing. I know that much.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But I think it's a 70s British printing, not 1964.
Well, and you bring up a good point there about Anthology spurring up new interest in the Beatles, and that therefore presumably leading to a reprint of Braun. And that leads me to my next number on my list, and that is Anthology.
The extraordinary thing about this book is it's full of revelations. It's not sort of tabloid headline stuff. But the extraordinary thing, I think, that anybody who reads it comes away from it, it's the first time that you've really understood what it was like to be at the heart of the hurricane that broke Beatlemania. What was it like to be John Lennon or Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, in the middle of all that madness? And there are more revelations, I suppose, of that nature in this book than in any previous book. And I think that's what makes it riveting, what makes it an important document.
So primarily, I would argue the documentary. Although the book is also influential, the main reason I would rank the documentary above the book is I am assuming that significantly more people viewed the documentary than read the book.
So you're counting this as important or influential, or both?
It's both.
Okay.
It's both because Anthology created so much interest in the Beatles, recreated so much interest in the Beatles, and it's not like it had stagnated, like there was nothing, obviously, in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. But a little bit of personal history. I was in high school when Anthology came out, and I told you that. And I wasn't an avid Beatles fan, certainly at that point, but people in my high school were talking about Anthology. They were talking about watching the documentary. They were wondering why the Beatles got rid of Pete Best. And you have all of these discussions going on among these 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders about the Beatles. Anthology was an event.
That is very interesting, because I had nobody in my world when that happened was of high school age, so I had nothing to gauge that generation. To me, surrounded by Beatle geeks, of course this was an event, but I wouldn't say it was true of every adult at the time. Maybe it was, and maybe among boomers probably, but...
Right, and I'd have to look back at the Nielsen ratings and see what they were, and obviously, my gosh, it was the mid-90s, and that seems so long ago now, considering the difference with streaming and the internet and all those sort of things. But I imagine it dominated Nielsen ratings. So you have simply Anthology scope. Really, one of the things I see Anthology as is as Paul, George, and Ringo and Apple wanting to reassert their control of the story, of the Beatles story, after having lost aspects of that control with the breakup, with the 70s, with the death of John. And you had these secondary sources, which happens in any narrative, in any historiography, really starting to take control. Sources like Shout. And you had individuals within the Beatles, such as Paul McCartney and George Harrison, who were not fond of the version of Beatles history that was contained in Shout.
Right.
And you had the Beatles, again, being aware to a certain extent of the versions of their history that were out there, not agreeing with that history. Is Anthology intended to make money? Yes, absolutely it is. And is it intended to reinvigorate younger generations in the Beatles? Absolutely it is. And it did, at least if my high school is any indication. But it's also going to have that bonus of them saying, this is our story, and we are the ones who are most qualified to tell it.
So you think that was implicit? That forget everything else you've seen or read, this is how it really happened, folks?
I think so. I think that was, I don't know how much that factored into the decision to do Anthology, but
it might have been the starting point, but it just seems like one of my takeaways from watching it was they can't even agree on their own history.
Right. But it's still them telling the story.
Right. Them revealing as much as they want to.
Right. Or it's still one of the Beatles telling the story. Even if they're telling 3 or 4 different versions of the story, they're still the ones in control of the story and not these secondary authors, the people who weren't there.
Right. Right. I guess one of the things that, as you say, and is part of historiographical, whatever, I can never say the word right. Historiographical, there you go, like a pro. Method is as much contemporaneous accounts of things as possible. It seems like the 1990s interviews was their final word on their history, despite the fact they could have dug deep and populated that with all kinds of contemporaneous interviews, and they didn't do that. They were limited, obviously with Lennon, they had to use what they had to 1980, but they could have told their entire story using interviews ending in 1970. And that would have been a very different documentary, but they didn't. I would argue it would make it more valuable.
That's a really good point. Now you have me wishing we had both.
Yeah. It nearly made my list, but again, it got shoved off by everything else I wanted to shoehorn into it. But I think ultimately it is something that I would, on a different list, if the criteria is Beatle media that every Beatle fan should have, absolutely. But in terms of reliability of a source, even though it's them, I would make that claim for it.
Right. And I understand that. I think that's perfectly valid. At the same time, it's one of those sources that you see in bibliographies. You see quotes from Anthology cropping up in secondary works, in group biographies, in individual biographies. And it's one of those sources that you can't escape and you can't ignore. And I really do think it reinvigorated attention to the band, also to their scholarship, and helped nudge the Beatles narratives away from the Lennon Remembers and the Shout narratives that had dominated for so long, because you do get more information from George and Ringo. You do get more attention paid to them. And you have McCartney advocating subtly and sometimes not so subtly for his particular version of Beatles history, which obviously does not agree with the Lennon Remembers and the Shout versions of Beatles history.
Right, right. So it is absolutely inescapably important.
Yeah.
It would be nice to have both. So my next one is one that I thought very demonstrably filled a conspicuous gap in Beatle historiography, and that is Christine Feldman Barrett's A Women's History of the Beatles.
That's my next one.
There you go. So, unquestionably, the history had mostly, almost entirely been written by men, by white men, by white Western men.
By Anglo-Saxon.
Yes. Yes.
Tradition American.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But someday maybe there will be, well, you know about the Katie Kapurch book that's about to come out?
Yes.
Blackbird? Okay. So we're getting that voice heard finally. But this was one that floors me that it took as long as it did into the 21st century for somebody to come up with a comprehensive history from this perspective that completely lays waste to the myths and the beliefs that have been espoused since the 60s about the Beatles as told by male writers.
I pretty much have the same thing, that ever since the 1960s, we had been sold one version of Beatles female fans. And that was that they were hysterical, they were irrational. Now, some of it is more extreme than others. I'm not saying every depiction was this negative.
And it's not monolithic.
Right. But you did have writers asserting that male fans liked the Beatles for their intelligence and their musicality, and female fans liked the Beatles for their appearance and nothing else.
Right.
And that male fans implicitly were able to understand the Beatles on an intellectual level at a way that female fans could not or would not.
It all circles back to Jan Wenner.
Actually, I believe that one of the writers, unfortunately, who I don't remember how much they tiptoe around that and how much they flatly state it, is Schaffner. So you have this narrative questioning the intelligence of female fans. And what Christine Feldman Barrett does extremely well is make two arguments in a very methodologically sound and extremely well-researched and cited book. One of her arguments is that, yes, the Beatles excited female fans, and female fans, we know, got excited, and you could term it hysterical and irrational at Beatles concerts. But her point is, why does that make them any less of a valued, important fan than male Beatles fans? And she counters with, I believe, a quote from Paul McCartney where he discusses male fans at soccer games or sporting events. It's not as if male fans at sporting events are known for their being rational, sedate, and calm. Well, and female fans at sporting events aren't necessarily known for being rational, sedate, and calm either. But her argument is basically, why does this devalue the experience of the female Beatles fan? In addition to that, she discusses all of the things that female fans did that have been overlooked for decades because they were inspired by the Beatles, and how they started these fan clubs, and how they started these mail campaigns, and how they entered into these letter writing correspondences with people associated with the Beatles, or Frida Kelly, or relatives of the Beatles, how they traveled to England, how they took on essentially adult responsibilities of their own initiative. They started bands. All of that had essentially been ignored or swept under the rug, or maybe occupied a very narrow aspect of the interpretation of the Beatles female fan, until Christine brought it front and center and essentially forced Beatles historiography to change its narrative.
Yes. Important stuff in plain sight that nobody touched until she did, and thank God she did, because she did so well and so comprehensively. Again, it's almost like Andy. It's like, well, who's going to write the book that outdoes this? At least has laid the groundwork pretty damn well in terms of the scope of what she's presented. Also talking about the importance of females in the lives of the individual Beatles and how that shaped them. Paul, yes, he lost his mother, but there was the female relatives that were around him. John, Mimi, Astrid, Mrs. Harrison, Ringo's mom, all these important women figures that shaped them and helped make them what they became, have been sort of marginalized in the history to this point, to varying degrees. So again, front and center, important stuff, things to think about and not gloss over.
Yes, I thought her work was excellent in every respect.
So it's refreshing to have a book that's not a million years old to put on our lists.
Yes, and absolutely necessary. And I personally have had nothing but good experiences with Beatles fandom, but I have had any number of people comment on my blog, female commenters who discuss being at old Beatle fests or conventions or conferences and being flat out ignored, being shouted down, being condescended to constantly. That was their experience, their personal experience for years, if not decades. Again, my personal experience has been nothing but good. But there are enough people out there, enough female fans out there who have different stories to tell, certainly indicating that this was an issue.
Yeah, it's crazy. I have seen that in conferences I've attended, and if it's because the speaker presenter is female or it's done on an individual basis, but we're well past the point of marginalizing people on the basis of gender.
Unless you're Jan Wenner.
Unless, yes. And he's exiting the stage at this point. My last one. Let's say for my important list, and it was the top of my important list, we've talked a lot about things, whether they be books, films, media, or the internet, that were influential or important in terms of perceptions. But obviously, I think still, he said hopefully as an author, the most important intake of data we get is through books. Mm-hmm. There's been any number of angles of their history. We've talked about the instruments, we've talked about the female perspective, we've talked about the first-person narrative with Anthology, we've talked about people with access to data, such as the recordings with Lewisohn. But until I found this book, quite by happenstance, I didn't know how to read a Beatles book. And that's The Beatles and the Historians.
Oh, no.
By Erin Torkelson Weber. Seriously. Changed my life, and it gave me an entirely fresh way of looking at everything I'd absorbed to this point, recognizing how to read this stuff and how to value it and how to assess data going forward. It's that important, and I want people to know that. We've talked about it on the show before, but I have so many authors on the show, so many books. I don't put people on the show that I think are valueless or worthless. Believe me, I have a lot more people coming at me than I could possibly handle. So if they're on my show, it's because I think there's some value to it. But if I were to point to anything besides Lewisohn as like a must-own on your shelf, it would be this, because this will teach you how to read a Beatle book, how to read any historiological work, like that word again, and how to assess the data you are taking in.
You can't see me, but I'm blushing. Well, all I can say is thank you, because that's what I wanted. I wanted to write a textbook. I was thinking about my students who have to assess information and historical works, and trying to think of how can I write a textbook that isn't about the same historiographical subjects that I covered when I was in college and graduate school, which again, some of them were fascinating. Mm-hmm. Some of them were less so. And so I just wanted to write that book so that people could look at it and say, this is what historians use. These are the standards that we use. And I'm so glad it did that for you.
Well, not just me. Everybody who became aware of it through the show and other places you've appeared in, including your own blog and your own podcast now, it's a game changer. There's no escaping that. And it's fine to be modest about it and all that, but it is very, very important. And even bigger than the Beatles. So yes, that's what it specifically is about, but if it gets you to absorb information with fresh eyes, that is a damned important thing, without being so dense and scholarly that it's unreadable. It is completely accessible, completely readable. That's a strength of it, is that it's not intimidating. I found it purely on sheer luck at ALA in Chicago. It was at an NCAP at the McFarlane's display. And it's, oh, Beatles picture. Oh, I should check this out. And I expected it to be something I would immediately put down. But I'm flipping through and it's like, oh, I can read this.
Oh, I know. You said at the fest that the cover was pretty cheap.
Well, and I understand it.
Yeah,
I know about publishing.
I didn't like
it's on other stuff too. Oh, tell me the title that you wanted to use.
Carry That Weight.
And what was the subtitle?
Oh, it's something about exploring the Beatles and their historiography.
Okay.
Just because I think Carry That Weight demonstrates so much of what their history is about, and how part of being a historical figure is carrying the weight of history on your shoulders.
Mm-hmm. As well as the weight of misinformation, misinterpretation,
right.
People getting it dead wrong.
Right.
And it serves really as a good filter that the things with the biggest hype or the biggest names attached to them doesn't make them the most worthy or important or valuable. We've talked about Gould. I need to have him on the show. That would be a cool conversation.
I would love to hear that one.
Well, you can be co-inquisitor.
I'd have to read his book again. It has been a while.
Yeah, me too. And there's just plenty of things that get plenty of attention. Now we find Philip Norman has threatened his George Harrison biography. The same guy who wrote probably the most scathing in memoriam of somebody who recently passed, The Side of Dave Dexter, when John Lennon was killed.
And I will be fascinated to read it. I really will. I encounter some fans who just say, well, we know what this is going to be, whether you're talking about the upcoming biography of Yoko or you're talking about Philip Norman's book on George or any of these works that are coming up, and they say, well, I know what this is going to be, so I'm not going to bother to read it. But my perspective is, even if it doesn't contain any new research, it's going to be fascinating just to see what it covers, what it doesn't, what it omits, how interpretations change, how dramatically interpretations change of George as a person, of George as a musician, what justification there is for these changes. Again, you have Norman spending the introduction of his Paul biography essentially explaining, this is why I was unfair to Paul McCartney for 40 years.
Yeah.
But essentially saying, I believe in that same introduction, I still don't see all that much value in examining George. Well, now he's examining George. Why? So that's really what fascinates me about any and all works coming out, even if you don't think that they will have value because the author has demonstrably shown bias or other issues before, they still have value because it's all a piece of the puzzle of how does it fit into the historiography? The author changed his interpretation. Why did he change his interpretation?
It's legacy time. He doesn't want to be on the wrong side of history.
And that very well may be it. That is my assumption as to why at least part of his motivation as to why he wrote the Paul biography.
Oh, yes. For the same guy to say John Lennon was 75% of the Beatles and to spend a career being as dismissive as he was, I think there was a certain recognition. It's like, God damn, this guy keeps going. He's universally beloved. People are going to hate me the day I die. That's going to be in my obit. I have to correct this. And that's why I think the McCartney bio came into being from Philip Norman. At the same time, he was on my show saying I would never write a book about George or Ringo. They're just not interesting. I guess the McCartney book didn't do the trick, so got to work on George now. You'll see if he's circling the drain, he starts work on the Ringo book, if he's got enough years left. I don't know.
I would love to see a slam dunk, well-researched, well-written Ringo book. I think that's one of the areas of Beatles historiography that we desperately need. I don't believe Philip Norman is the right candidate for that job.
No, and I would say the same of George. There's been any number of really good books on George. There's a fantastic one by Simon Lang on his music. But as far as what made him tick, it's not going to come from the Harrison estate, obviously.
Right.
But it would be wonderful for somebody to do a deep dive psychohistory of him, because as fascinating as John is, I think George is no less fascinating from that perspective. When you really completely take him off his pedestal and are as honest as you can be, it's fascinating. You had said in your blog one time about him being an introvert in an extrovert's world, which I found a great summation, if you want, in a nutshell, the George issue. But there's plenty of other facets to explore for sure.
I understand why people would be reluctant to read works that they already know going into it are presumably going to be flawed. And you only have so much time to read things.
Right.
So if you have to make that assessment and determine it's not worth your time, I completely understand it. But I usually tend to believe that if you have the time, all of it has some level of value, even if just to see where it fits into the scope of the historiography.
Err on the side of inclusivity.
There you go.
I will say, for a book that has gotten a lot of bad rap, and I will say it's a mixed bag, which is The Love You Make, Stephen Gaines and Peter Brown, I am very much looking forward to what they've got coming out, the oral history, which purports to be the unfiltered interviews they did for that book. I always thought that it was going to be an amazing thing anyway when I heard that Stephen Gaines had made some announcement a year or two ago that they were going to make that stuff available, the same way Albert Goldman's archives are available at Columbia University. So I was looking forward to, that's going to be amazing to access. Well, now, in their fashion, they're doing us the favor of putting it out in the form that they are. So that is something I can't wait to actually see.
I agree with you. If they are unfiltered, if they are just the recordings that they took and not edited in any way by Brown and Gaines, then those would be incredibly valuable. I can't wait to see them.
Yeah. I kind of toyed with the idea for a long time about having one of those guys on the show, but this will give me the reason to, if they're up for it. I know Peter Brown certainly is getting up in age, but this potentially could be a great, valuable addition to Beatles scholarship.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm always an advocate for release the primary sources we were talking about. Lewisohn, obviously, those are not going to get released. Those tapes are not going to become available, unfortunately. But it would be ideal for Beatles scholars and fans if they did. Or Jackson, and I'm sure we'll talk about this when we get to our discussion of Peter Jackson's documentary. Just release the tapes. Give us the tapes. Give us everything, really. I think it was Brown who said that when, and again, Brown has issues.
Yes.
I believe it's Brown who said that when Paul flat out told Klein, "I'm going to sue you," Klein laughed. So you could theorize that Klein just didn't believe that Paul would go through with it because of the bad PR hit he would take, because of how the other Beatles would and did turn against him, because of how the fans took it. Considerable amount of evidence indicates Paul's reputation took hard hits when he was the one who sued the Beatles. And so I think you have quotes from John Eastman in Apple to the Core, where his response to the Klein issue is, he says something to the effect of, Klein didn't respect John Eastman's intelligence, so Klein didn't expect that the Eastmans or Paul would be able to win the trial, and also that Paul was a chicken shit, that he wouldn't go through with it.
Right.
So I think that may have significantly factored into Klein's evident refusal to woo Paul McCartney, is, I don't have to bother. I don't think he'll go with the nuclear option. And it ultimately turns out that Klein read Paul wrong in that respect.
And yet, even after that reality hits them, you want a divorce? Here's what a divorce looks like.
Yeah.
They're still describing in great detail how their past disputes could amicably be worked out, and we don't understand why Paul is doing this kind of thing. It's like, why? What did you have to gain? I'm sure familiar with the story of them supposedly trying to trick him into showing up at a recording session.
Right.
And if he'd shown up, then he would have no legal ground to end the partnership. There's plenty of research to be done there that I don't feel was fully answered by Doggett's book.
I agree.
Yeah.
Because so much happens in such a short amount of time during the breakup. And we've got legal issues going on. We've got financial issues going on. We've got personal disagreements. We've got Klein. We've got Yoko and Linda and kids and car accidents and obviously music and other issues like that. But it just appears to me that the very crucial legal elements, particularly in the breakup period, have been, well, this is what the first sources we have available, mainly McCabe, say. This is what it says. And so this is the version that almost everybody is going to offer.
Right. They default to in the absence of anything else.
Right. But that doesn't mean it's the correct one.
No, sure doesn't. There's definitely some ripe ground there for exploring.
Yeah. We just need to get law degrees.
Yes, we do.
In our abundant spare time.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis.
And The Jerry Lewis Show will not be seen tonight. Instead, the following very, very special program is brought to you in lively black and white on NBC.